Brooklyn Crow here. The methodology of New Testament interpretation that I am going to be presenting on today is the use of extracanonical Jewish text. There are many Jewish writings that either predate, are concurrent, or postdate the writings of the New Testament. We understand the need to know the Old Testament and to know the background of the Old Testament because many of the New Testament writers quoted the New Testament and it helped form and inform their religion. But there's also many traditions and understandings of Judaism leading up to the first century that are outside of either the New Testament or the Old Testament. So what this methodology does is it seeks to understand these alternate texts. Why is it important to understand the first century Judaism? Well, most of the New Testament writers were in fact Jewish, and so it's important for us to understand their worldview so we can really understand their writings. As Wright Bird says, quote, "We cannot understand the New Testament unless we make sense of the historical environment in which the early church was conceived and grew in the first century AD." End quote. Unlike today, we see Christianity and Judaism as two separate religions, but early Christianity was not separate from Judaism, but it was rather a branch of it. So Bauckham, in Hearing the New Testament, says about Christianity, quote, "The Christianity of the New Testament period must be seen not as something quite different from Judaism, but as a distinctive form of Judaism." End quote. Many of the New Testament writers, they would have accepted and known these non-canonical texts and would have valued them and would have been shaped by them. These extra-canonical Jewish texts, they give us better insight into Jewish life. We can better understand the social factors and everything that would have been going on during this time. The purpose of the New Testament, it isn't to explain the Jewish context, it isn't to give a history. So to get these things, we have to look outside of the New Testament itself. So a brief synopsis of the historical developments of this methodology. Ever since the beginning of Christianity, scholars have been using these Jewish texts to better inform New Testament study and Christian theology. As McNamara says, quote, "Right from New Testament times onwards, Jewish traditions and writings have provided an irresistible fascination for Christians and Christian scholars." End quote. So a lot of the Jewish Apocrypha and other books that we have today were actually preserved not by Jews, but by Christians. They saw the relevance of them and sought to preserve them. A lot of the early Christian philosophers and scholars really saw the value in their work was informed by these Jewish texts. Some examples would be Justin Martyr, Tertullian, and Origen. As McNamara points out, Origen was known as, quote, "father of hermeneutics and biblical interpretation in the church," end quote. So he was very influential in the Christian community and scholarship. And so he had a lot of, he sought to know more about Jewish learning. He had a lot of dialogue and was in conversation a lot with these Jewish scholars. It really informed his work, and so it really set a foundation for those scholars and that would follow him. A lot of these scholars, they used the Jewish writings, but it wasn't until about the 17th century that scholars really began to use it as a way of better interpreting the New Testament. John Lightfoot helped to really set a foundation in actually using this as a method for clarifying the New Testament text. Also in the 19th century, scholars began to really understand or really focus on rabbinic literature as a way to better understand the Pauline text. Because Paul was a Pharisee and his writings are very Jewish, many scholars believe that to better understand Pauline thought and writings, we have to better understand the rabbinic literature at the time. 20th century, most scholars just look for parallels between the Jewish text and the New Testament writings, but Paul Fiebig and Morton Smith were two scholars who really sought to dig deeper to better understand the Jewish text and to lead to deeper study into this method. And studies of the Jewish text in relation to the New Testament are still relevant today. Some key components. I'm going to talk about some of the major branches of the extra-canonical Jewish texts that we're talking about and how they kind of impact New Testament interpretation. So we have the Old Testament Apocrypha, or known as the hidden books, which are additional Old Testament books. These were written before the New Testament and would have been familiar, the New Testament scholar or writers would have been familiar with them. As Evan points out, it is, quote, an indispensable bridge linking the worlds of the Old Testament and the New Testament, end quote. Then we have the pseudepigrapha. These either predate or postdate the New Testament, and we see similar themes in the New Testament here as we do here. This gives a good context to knowing about the various Jewish communities that were around at the time. We also have the Dead Sea Scrolls, which help give parallels for New Testament vocabulary and ideas. Then we have people like Philo, who was a Jewish author in the 1st century. He did a lot of work of interpreting elements of the Old Testament allegorically, and we see some of these similar parallels in the New Testament. So by using Philo's work, we can see how the New Testament writers may have interpreted Old Testament scripture. Then we have Josephus, who gives a lot of Jewish history. And as I said before, the New Testament isn't necessarily written as a history, although it does give some history of the early church, but this really gives a good background into what was going on during the time. Then we have the rabbinic literature, which helps to give clarification of the teaching and ideas that would have been impacting the world of the New Testament. So to apply this method to a New Testament pericope, I'm going to use John 10, verses 33 through 36. So to give a little background to this text, Jesus has just claimed to be the Son of God. The Pharisees are all mad and ready to stone him for being blasphemous. Well, as a way of defending himself, in verse 34, Jesus says, quote, "Is it not written in your law? Quote, I said you are gods," end quote. Here scholars believe and agree that Jesus is quoting Psalm 82:6. Jerome Neri has done a lot of study on Psalm 82 to try to figure out more about what it's talking about and what the Jewish tradition behind this would have been. So he found in his studies that many of the Jewish midrashim interpret this as relating to the giving of the law on Mount Sinai. So you are gods. Gods here is referring to immortals. This goes back to the Garden of Eden and with Adam. When Adam, before he sinned, he was without death. Death was not a part of his reality. He was immortal. And so the Jewish scholars and the tradition of Psalms 82 says that when the children of Israel received Torah, they became immortal. They were no longer with sin, and they were holy, and therefore they were called gods. But when they fell back in sin with the golden calf, they were no longer immortal. Here, Jesus can use this verse as a means of defending himself, because he's saying those without sin and those who are holy are called gods. Jesus isn't blaspheming because Jesus is sinless. As Evan says, quote, he has every right to claim divinity, end quote. Jesus isn't claiming to make himself anything. As Nehre says, quote, God himself makes Jesus Son of God. Just as God made Israel God by delivering the Torah, Jesus refutes the essence of the charge by maintaining that God makes him what he is, namely a consecrated servant, agent, and apostle, end quote. So here's just a small example of how we can use extracanonical Jewish text as a way of kind of informing and shedding light on the New Testament writings. Effective. There are many pros as to why we should use extracanonical Jewish text. One is that it does offer more insight into the culture and the Jewish worldview. As McNamara says, quote, the reader of the New Testament will find some traditions and legends which the writers could not have taken from the Old Testament, end quote. So one example of this is in Jude's work in the New Testament. He references the book of Enoch. And while Jude is a part of the canon, Enoch is not. So we can better understand what Jude and what these other New Testament writers are talking about if we have a better understanding of it ourselves. Another example is the canon doesn't offer insight into the intertestamental period. And so if we use some of the Jewish texts, such as the Maccabees, it helps shed light on the evolution of Judaism between the Old Testament and the New Testament. As Wright and Bird say, quote, the Maccabean revolt became classic and formative in the same way as the Exodus and the other great events of Israel's history, end quote. So if these things were forming the New Testament writers, it's important for us to also know them. Another pro is that we can get a better understanding of how the New Testament writers would have performed exegesis of the Old Testament writings. Because if we know how the Jewish tradition exegeted the Old Testament scriptures, we can have a better understanding of how they did. A third pro is that these Jewish texts are referred to by all major scholars. I already talked about how the first scholars used them, and so do other major scholars. And so for us to better delve into biblical studies, we need to have at least a base understanding. And then a fourth pro, Craig Evans, he points out 8 different points of how using these texts can better clarify the New Testament for us. And those are word meaning, syntax, meaning of concepts, history, historical, social, and religious context, exegetical context, hermeneutical context, and canonical context. So there are also some cons to this methodology, being that it can be hard because there's such a vast amount and diversity of these texts that we are talking about here. So one con is we know that these texts played into the worldview and ideology of the New Testament writers, but they didn't necessarily use them as sources. It's very hard for us to pinpoint, exact texts that maybe they were referring to or that informed their writings. The texts that we have today, a lot of times it's hard to really know, were these actually informing their worldview or not. Another con is that many of these writings were for specific groups. So unless we know that they were circulated, widely throughout the Jewish world, we can't think that they were really informing early Christianity. There were so many different styles and opinions and beliefs within the Jewish community during this time that you can't just pick one text to represent the whole. Is that you can't just compare these texts with the New Testament at face value. Because to really be able to apply this method, you have to have a better understanding of the Jewish texts for what they are, and to really understand them before you can start using them for New Testament interpretation. In and of itself. As Bauckham says here in the New Testament, quote, we must use the Jewish literature in the first place to understand Judaism. Only someone who understands early Judaism for its own sake will be able to use Jewish texts appropriately and accurately in the interpretation of the New Testament. End quote. There are also some of these extra-canonical Jewish texts that they may reference the same scripture or Old Testament imagery as the New Testament does, but they may be doing it for a different exegetical purpose. And so we can't just assume that, these two things use the same, the same reference, so they have to be parallels. That is not always the case. You have to really delve deeply into both of these texts to really know what they're saying and what their purpose is. Another con is that it can be hard to know the exact date of writing for some of these things. A lot of these texts were written actually after the New Testament. And so while it still may reflect these old traditions, it can be hard to know whether, it would have been relevant for the New Testament writers or not. So in conclusion, this methodology of using extra-canonical Jewish text to help interpret the New Testament, it is very needed because it gives us a broader view and clarity for the worldview and the ideologies that the New Testament writers had. And the more context and the better we understand that, the better we're going to be able to actually understand the purpose and the intention of the New Testament. However, it can be a very daunting task to do this methodology because there is such a variety in quantity of the literature. So if you're new, you can't just jump in and automatically start applying these things, but you really do have to have a good understanding of the Jewish text to be able then to help inform your understanding of the New Testament. Thank you so much.